Really excited to be able to present for SYNERGY HomeCare Beyond the Senior Client, Understanding the Family Dynamics and Their Impact on Clients and Plan of Care. Excited about this particular one. This is for the healthcare providers, and I think it's an important topic as, again, it is not just the clients that we work with, but families as well. I think this is a helpful little slide as we think about family dynamics. No one can drive us crazy unless we give them the keys. I think that when we think about working with our clients, it seems by an individual that is kind of an easy topic, difficult in its own way. But when we add in the dynamic of family members, friends, however they're defining that family system, we then add a new layer to the relationship that we have with our client. And it's often there that we find ourselves often stuck with how do we work with this new family and not just the client. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today, which is exploring the challenging situations that arise when family members play a part in patient or client interactions, how past relationships impact present family roles. We're going to discuss sibling roles. We're going to talk about grief and loss and how that plays into the whole family dynamic, and talk about social, family, and cultural impacts that also interplay with this role. I want to share in terms of where I come from for this conversation is that as a social worker for 30 plus years, working with families often in crisis situations, that I have seen the best as well as the worst of kind of what happens in a family when things are not going well and the different dynamics. But I've also found ways to work with the different family members to, I think, bring about the best reaction and the best situation that we can come to. I think that the first piece to any discussion is first about the language that we use. I think often when we're talking about our clients, our families, our patients, particularly in the relationship of other healthcare providers, that we often use terminology that brings out the most negative aspects of that dynamic. So I'd like to challenge each one of you to think about redefining the words that you use and to shift from the idea of talking about difficult families to involved families. Because just the change in the language that we use can change our viewpoint, our belief in where these families are coming from, and I think we approach it in a very different way. So again, my challenge to each of you as you go back and work with your families, as you go back and have discussions with your healthcare colleagues as a team, is to really shift from the idea of difficult families to involved families. For those of you who have sat in on any of my webinars in the past, you will recognize this Stephen Covey image that is the circle of influence, and I'm using this in relationship to family caregiving. I think as healthcare professionals, and also when you think about it from the perspective of a family member, to always remember there's things we can control, things we can influence, and things we cannot control. And where we put our time, our energy, our resources, our money, that is where our energy gets used up the most. And we often put it in the wrong bucket. We often put it in the I can control this bucket, which is really our smallest of the buckets and the one we have the least opportunity to attain. So again, really thinking about what can you control in this situation, what can you influence, and what can you not control. I think we need to start with why family caregiving can get so complicated. And some of these we're going to explore as we move forward. But really, when we think about families, first the complication is, how are we defining a family? And today that is very different than it used to be. You know, we no longer can look at a family as that immediate kind of kin, which would be, you know, mother, father, siblings, uncles, aunts, cousins, that really we now see extended family, step families, new families, divorced family relationships that still remain tighter than maybe with a biological family member. We have friend relationships that often are our surrogate to a biological or family relationship in terms of importance. We have intimate relationships that may not have the benefit of a legal marriage, depending on the state that one resides in, and yet we still want to support and ensure that the people that have been identified as the main caregiver, the main spokesperson for that individual, is respected and listened to. What is the history of caregiving in the family itself? And again, those often run very deep, and sometimes when somebody is shifting what that history has always been, it takes a few attempts at being able to allow them to move away from what has always been the quote-unquote norm in that family. We have to think about views on autonomy versus risk around care issues. As we said, we're going to talk about grief and loss and the divorce and the step families. We also have to think about, are there unhealed quote-unquote wounds, emotional wounds in the family? And are they shared by every member of the family? Oftentimes there are wounds that one family member carries which may be invisible to everyone else or may not be respected by others because they themselves don't carry that same wound. We're going to talk briefly about cultural and diversity issues which play into any time we're working with any family or individual, that family climate and its impact on care, and then needing to think about what the practicalities of care are and how those also influence the relationships. So the finances, the family responsibilities outside of this caregiving relationship, and the location of all the parties that we are talking about. As I go through these slides, please feel free to write your questions in, your comments, and then at the end of the session, we will review those and I will answer all of those. I want to talk about kind of identifying families from A to Z, and the reality is I've only identified them up to V because I couldn't come up with some good words for the last two letters. But again, I put these out not in a way to label a family and that we use these, I don't use these without thinking about what is the behavior and how does it shift and change my behavior in my relationship with them, and more importantly, my communication style in how I'm going to approach them. So I don't do this to diagnose a family. I do this to give myself some opportunity to really think through what's my best approach with this family. Many of these behaviors and personalities come out sideways and need some investigation to understand. And again, as I've shared in the past with families and with other clinicians, is the more somebody feels out of control, the more controlling they become. And often some of these behaviors and some of these identifiers are going to come out, even if that is not their true way of approaching other situations. I think probably as I move through this list, and I won't spend a lot of time with these individually, but I think it's important, and I'm sure that each one of you could identify families that you have worked with in the past. So that anxious family who really requires a lot of hand-holding, a lot of processing through all of the information, And again, these families may be identified and defined in this way during this time period. This may not be who they have always been. However, we do have to recognize that some of these behaviors, some of these identifiers may also be who this family and individuals are along a long-term continuum. And so we are seeing this behavior today. We may not be able to change it because it's really not about what's happening today. It's about who they have been, and that these are long-standing issues that would need to be worked on in a much different way. The angry family, again, this may be situational to what's happening, and anger is often about lack of control, lack of ability to make a difference in what's happening, and feeling that they have really no opportunity to change what is going on. But it may also be historical. So we have to recognize that these may be historical behaviors and characteristics of the individuals that make up this family. The bossy or bully family, again, these may be things that are coming from a lack of sense of control, or these may be ways that they have handled situations and feel that it is their best manner in which to get something accomplished. Conflicted families, this often is happening where there's a part of them that knows the behavior, the decision that needs to be made, but it's so difficult from an emotional perspective. It steps outside of their norm of how they would approach a situation that they really do have some conflict. The depressed or sad family, and this may not be as a family unit, but individuals within that family, again, either situational or historical. The family that lives in denial often needs to hear it from more than one source, and often from the highest ranking member of the team. So we should not take it personally if our communication and the message that we're delivering is not always heard by all family members, and then somebody else provides the same exact message and it's taken as gospel. But it may be that this is a family that, again, needs to hear it more than once and may need to hear it from different members of a team. The dependent and demanding family, which, again, may not be all family members, and may be because they are feeling so overwhelmed and there are aspects of parts of their emotional needs that are not being fulfilled. And so they're really demanding to be fulfilled in that way by somebody else and something else. The dramatic or manipulative family, the expressive family, which I think we should, again, shift to see it as a positive, because at least we know where they stand. I would much rather know where a family stands and then be able to manage and deal with that behavior or that communication than, as we move down the list, the silent or reticent family who doesn't want to share what's going on, and really it comes out in almost a passive-aggressive way. The manic or restless family, sometimes with these family members, you really can't even get them to be in one room and sit down and really hear through the whole conversation, because they either are avoiding it and being really avoidant with it, or they just can't listen to all that information and process it through. The orderly and controlled family, again, it feels that nothing is getting through to them. It feels that there's no emotionality in what you're sharing. Very controlled in their responses, but again, there's often with these family members something that goes beyond. The silent or reticent family, as we compared a few minutes ago to the expressive. The superior family, and again, we need to remember that insecurity often breeds superiority or a sense of superiority, and so really recognize that this is someone who probably has a lot more insecurity. They just are puffing themselves up. The rambling or talkative family, and the vague family. There is a tool that had been developed and a conversation that had happened, and this happened actually many years ago, back in 2006, but you can still find this information, and on the internet, if you type in National Consensus Development Conference on Caregiving Assessment Tool. It's about a 56-page document, and it really is a valuable tool to review and give some good questions to be asking of caregiving family members as you begin to put together a picture of what's happening for this individual and then for them as part of a family system. Again, this data is, now going on 11 years old, but still has incredible value. I think the fact that we haven't seen there much movement in taking this tool and really moving forward with it says something about where we are as a society and a system within healthcare that maybe hasn't looked enough to what's happening from a family caregiving perspective and really sees the family caregiver as only a extension to the client themselves, but not as an important feature to how we can work with them and the success we're going to have with a client. But I think, again, valuable information. What is the history of caregiving in the family? I talked a little bit about that a moment ago, and I think it's really important that traditions can become complicated for future generations. What worked in the past may not work today, and yet family members still have a sense of entitlement over remaining in that same kind of steadfast way that it used to always be done. So, for instance, the family that would take the generation before them into their home after retirement or when any illness struck, and that person lived with that family and grandchildren in a multi-generational home till often their death, may not be practical in today's society for many families based on, one, the location of where people are at, the fact that oftentimes all members of the family are working, or whether they're working in an outside position in a job, or they're working in terms of the time they're spending on their children and all of the activities that are going on or volunteering, that it doesn't lead to the capability of keeping family members in their home in that way. People are downsizing. The homes are smaller, yet we require in many ways a bigger footprint in our home settings. So what does that mean for future generations when there has been an expectation that this is what's going to be what is always anticipated for that family? And it's something that oftentimes families won't talk about until the moment where the expectation kicks in, and then there is just, kind of a dissatisfaction. And what do you mean you're not going to take me in and I have to move to some other setting? It goes back to the whole sense of communication and how important that is on an ongoing basis, particularly if someone in the family is going to shift the dynamic of what has come before them. We need to think about roles and rivalries in a family. There's Janet Evans from Winona University shared that caregivers morph into the caregiver role from being in a previous relationship with that of the client as well as other caregivers. That family caregiver role is not a static one, and it changes with time as the caregiving relationship changes from beginning through a middle period and the end. This is, again, where we often have to think about the kind of families that we have now moved into. There's divorce and remarriages, which means there's often step families involved, which can really shift, particularly as individuals get older, as to then who is responsible for whom. And this became really clear to me when I was working with a family many years ago, and one of the adult daughters, or a couple of the adult daughters, shared with me that they had a difficult relationship with their step siblings, that they really wanted to focus on mom, and they weren't connected with stepdad. And so in my mind, I thought, oh, this was a late remarriage for this family. They had never been a family together. They had only kind of done visits as a kind of combined family. But in talking more and more with this group, it turned out that this had been a remarriage 30 years prior, which meant that these adult children had been together as young adults, and that this father, who is a stepfather to several of the kids, had been in their lives for many years, and there had been shared resources from day one. Yet in this moment of crisis, in this moment of caregiving need of actually both of the elders, they had then taken back their side as to their biological side and no longer saw themselves as a joined unit, although they had lived like that for 30 years. So it really identified to me how the divorce and the step-family relationship is not just about a timing, but it's often that, again, in that moment of crisis, we tend to kind of go to almost like a scarcity of resources, and we want them for ourselves, whether it's the time of that parent or their resources, their finances, etc. So it's important to really explore those type of relationships when you know that there's a family system that is swirling around a client or patient. Thinking about sibling relationships both prior and today, to that need, that moment of need. And many siblings have really never had to make life decisions together. You know, many siblings at the age of 18, you know, went their separate ways, whether to school or work or moved into another family system. And so there wasn't really any need to make big decisions together. And yet now they come back as adults who have probably had 20, 30 years of decision making with other people, to then come back to this often stranger, even though they may be siblings, from a decision making place, and now have to make the biggest decision of all. How do we spend mom's resources? Where do we put her for care? How do we move through this? So really, this remains a constant no matter what age the family system. What is the quality of the relationship? And again, I go back to this sense of unhealed emotional wounds. I like this saying that says, what we learn when we are spoon-fed as babies will echo in our ears as we feed our parents. I think it speaks to the magnitude and of the impact of what we have received in our youth, our formidable years, our young adult, and even into adult childhood. What we gain from others is often what we then have to give back. And yet when we, from a healthcare professional standpoint, look at this and look at families and see that they are not providing the level of care that we think they should rise to, we question that quality of that relationship without really knowing what came before. And I really think a lot about this, and I've thought a lot about this when I've worked with families, that I am getting to see them in such a small moment of time, and there is so much that has come before that often we are not privy to unless we present the questions and ask them in ways that people feel comfortable to share. This became really clear to me as a hospice worker many years ago when we had a woman who was in our care for advanced dementia. And this was a woman who was living in a assisted living facility, receiving her hospice care there. And when we would come in, she would be that elder who, when we came to her and any staff came up to her, she would have this big grin on her face and this smile, and she would light up, and her eyes would really light up at the sound of somebody being there and giving her, attention. And we as a team saw the two daughters who seemed so removed from their mom's care. And initially the team really, again, a matter of semantics, saw this as a disengaged, uncaring sibling group. And yet I had an opportunity to really spend some time with them, and in talking with them, what they opened up to me and shared was that the woman that we saw today was not the mother that they had over their childhood and growing up years. That what we didn't see was the woman who was impacted so greatly by a serious and persistent mental illness, that they grew up with both emotional and physical abuse at her hands, and that as adults, the most they could do was to ensure that she was in a safe environment and that she had her care needs met, but they could not be the caregiver for her, and they needed to really remain very removed from all aspects of her care because they were so wounded and had such unhealed relationship with her. And so it really has resonated with me all these years as to, again, who we see, and it didn't change as a team our care for this woman because, again, she deserved that care in our eyes, but for her children, they could not do that. And they, unlike many, could at least ensure that she was in a safe place with good care surrounding her. I had a young family who, when the husband received an ALS diagnosis and was on hospice, again, recognizing that so much had come before this diagnosis, and this was a couple who, right before his diagnosis, was separating and looking at divorce, and the diagnosis pulled her back in to provide the end-of-life care. But again, this was a wounded relationship, and it's very difficult to provide strong, supportive, emotionally powerful care when you are wounded. And so again, as a team, we really had to work with her to ensure that she didn't have regret over how she provided the care and was there for him in his last months, but that she was also supported in the fact that this was a complicated relationship and certainly going to be complicated grief. We have to remember that not everyone in the family has the same experience because we often grow up with the same parent, but by a few years of time, that they may be different. The resources they have available to them may be different. The time they have available to offer to one child may be very different to offer to 3 children that they now have. So families living under the same roof in the same time frame may, again, experience very different relationships, and we may see that when siblings come together, and it's almost as if the relationship that they have with our client is as if it's 2 different clients because they both are coming at it from such a different role in this person's life. And again, not everyone can be in the same place of healing and forgiveness. And that's a really important thing for, I think, as healthcare professionals, for us to remember. And we have to try to provide an opportunity for someone to receive what they can from that relationship so it limits the complication during grief. How people approach and how families members approach the idea of autonomy and risk can really impact care issues and can impact how they play upon us in terms of the care that we can provide to any one person. Each family is a collection of individuals. Reactions to illness will be affected by variables such as personality, coping, age, maturity, gender, relationship with that person, intelligence, their education, their mental and physical health, their knowledge and experience with illness. Again, family members hold different views on the diagnosis and treatment options. And we see this often when it comes down to difficult decisions. It is why it is such a gift to both the client as well as to the healthcare team if a healthcare directive is in place, so that we can go back to the language and the words of that client, so that we can ensure that families who, again, hold very different views on what is going on and what is available can listen to the words of the client, even if they are no longer able to communicate that. What is the capacity of the family members themselves? We often see this as we have two elders in a couple, where one is still identified as more of the decision-making maker, but their own capacity for understanding what's going on is limited by some of their own illnesses and perhaps cognition, but it has not risen to a place of inability to be a part of that decision-making team. Grief and loss is often felt differently from different people. Part of that is just personality and emotional capacity. Part of it is experience and how much somebody has experienced grief and loss in their own lives, and how does that interplay with today. And then different expectations of caregivers, both caregivers from the outside, from those that are coming from a professional caregiving level, to what is their expectation of what it means to be a family caregiver. And is that very involved, or is that limited in scope? We have to think about the practicalities of care and how that impacts family caregivers and how it impacts how we see them. I think that for many, when families start talking about wanting to limit the services that somebody is receiving, we immediately, and again, it goes back to being really cautious about the language we put on others. But we often say, oh, they must be wanting to keep the inheritance, or they're just trying to limit how much money has to be spent. And the reality is there may be that, but that doesn't always mean an ill intent. It may be that they recognize that, mom and dad have limited resources, and if all of those resources are spent on mom, what does that mean for dad if in a few years he then needs that same level of care? So I think we often see it as ill intent when it may be very smart way of approaching it, but we don't ask the questions, they don't divulge that information, and so we go off as a healthcare team to make our own decisions about what that means. The reality is there are income disparities, and there are perceived inequities in distribution of family estate and money. And you may have two siblings who themselves have very different income levels and level of security from a financial perspective, who don't feel they have the same to give to mom. They don't have that same flexibility of taking off unpaid leave to be able to be with mom. And yet there's a judgment associated with that that they feel often from us as the healthcare team, but as much from their sibling or other family members. And they don't want to, it's a sense of shame that they don't have as much or the same as others in the family. And so they don't really talk about why they've made the decision they have. But often if you did spend the time to understand that, you would understand that it comes from a practicality perspective and not from a level of care and love. The burden of care. Others may be glad that someone else is taking the bulk of responsibility, but then can feel jealous over time, particularly if there's any compensation. And we often see this in families where, again, one family member may live closer, may have, again, more opportunity. They're not working outside the home, and so that they can provide more care. And it relieves a burden to the other family members, but it also brings together that client and family caregiver in a way that others then can't break into. And so there's a sense of loss of that relationship, that bond, that is only because of the practicality and not because someone doesn't want that. And so that's a difficult thing to sometimes overcome. Thinking about location issues where families, they're more concerned about playing a part or being a part of care than about the best care for the patient. And again, this is not always by ill intent. I had a family with a woman who had advanced Alzheimer's, again, was on hospice, so her level of capacity was very reduced. But she had 3 loving children who all wanted mom to be spending time with them in their home. And so they all kind of shared her time, and she would go from home to home to home, and then back to her home for a little bit, and then back to each home. And what we as a healthcare team saw, that each one of those moves brought her kind of down one more level, because it took so much out of her, and having to kind of continually realign what she could see as her reality and her environment, and continual readjustment. And so we had to work with the family that by choosing one location, it wasn't choosing favorites within the family, but it really was the best result for mom. And so again, sometimes decisions are made out of an incredible sense of love and commitment, but they're still not the right decision. And so we as the healthcare professional often need to come in and kind of explain that in a way that people then don't feel hurt, that they are not the ones that mom gets to stay with. It is important as a healthcare professional, I think, to truly have a sense of what the cultural and diversity issues are in any family. And again, I see that the differences in culture go way beyond just ethnic, racial, or religious, but they really go through to the culture of what that person does professionally, where they live via, East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, etc., all of that level of education, etc. So culture can be in many different ways defined, and we have to get a good picture of what does that mean for this family. The other piece is that we often have to recognize that we cannot generalize a description of any group and define it to a task list or to a checklist, because not every individual who may identify or be identified as a, in a cultural or ethnic diverse way or minority may not engender those same characteristics that we read about in a book, that everything is kind of whittled down to, a few pages. So we have to ensure that we understand it from the family's perspective as to what does this mean for them. Working with diverse families holds many of the same practice strategies as working with individuals from majority culture. You always begin with the client sitting with you. And if the client is able to express, then that's where we start. And it's okay to ask questions. Is there something about your, religious or cultural belief that we as a team need to better understand to ensure that we are providing the best care? And it's okay to ask questions as long as we are not burdening that family or client with having to teach us everything we need to know. Thinking about family crisis, past and present, and really understanding what is this family about? Is there a history of domestic abuse? And is it known by all? Is there a history or a present issue with substance abuse? The finances, is there a decrease in seniors' net worth, and have that limited their options and increased the need to receive financial assistance, personal care from adult children? Are the seniors spending their kids' inheritance, and what does that mean in terms of how the family is reacting to the kind of care we may be providing? We have to be aware that there are increases in financial exploitation occurring, which may be more situational than just a bad kid, but we also have families where, Jimmy, we don't involve him because Jimmy can't be trusted to be here with mom. He's going to ask her for things. Thinking about the housing crisis, we recognize that, again, there are some more families where there's shared housing space. And what does that mean for us when we come in to provide care? Is there an expectation that we're not only providing care for grandma, but the college student is going to eat each meal that our care provider is making up? And are people protecting family secrets? Are there secrets that are happening within the family that we as healthcare professionals haven't identified, but we have a sense that there is something else going on, and we need to be able to ask questions or explore carefully, but understand it, because it is going to impact the way that we are going to work with a client and the family itself. We have to recognize particularly that age itself, the aging process, the disease process, is a time of transition for all involved. It's a time of having to say goodbye. It's a time of losing capacity and ability to communicate with certain individuals. Older adults are trying to incorporate their changing physical and emotional state into how they define themselves, often at the same time that families step up and feel like they have to be the decision maker, that mom no longer has the capability of making these decisions, even if she does, from a capacity perspective. And how do we manage that when we have to say to a client's daughter, I really need to hear from your mom what is most important in this situation. I do want to hear from you as well, but let's start with where your mom is at. And that's difficult when we're working with families. What will that family look like when their parents are gone, or when that client is gone? And oftentimes you start seeing people playing the role that they haven't yet received, but they're anticipating that they are now going to be the identified kind of matriarch or patriarch of the family. They're playing that role even if it is not theirs yet to play. And what are other stressors going on in the family? You know, we often, when we see family caregivers, we see them as the caregiver to that client that we are working with. But what does that mean for who is in their home? What is going on with their children? Both good and bad. Are they expecting the birth of a grandchild? Are they having a child that's going to be graduating high school and going off to college? And this is the time that they wanted to be able to share that transition with, and now they're kind of relegated to being the adult daughter caregiver. So what else is going on in that individual's life? And that's where that national conversation about family caregiving tools are so important, because it really does explore that, and it gives us some language to use to ask those types of questions. Things for all of us to remember is that most families fall in a continuum between healthy and dysfunctional. You only have to know that by thinking about your own family, and how would others identify you. I often think as a social worker and as someone who has worked in home-based services for so many years, that what will a caregiving group or a home care agency think, hospice agency think, when they come into my own parents' home to provide care? Will I be that difficult daughter because I know about what my expectations are, and will they think that I have too many high expectations? So think about it from your own perspective before you start judging the family in front of you. We have to remember that family members' actions influence all members, even if the behavior, the communication is not directed at that person. Most important is that we all have to remember that we can do all the right things and still not solve a problem. It is key that we remember that sometimes the crisis that we are involved in with this family is only one small part of how this family operates. This often falls into the mailbox conversation. For any of you who have worked certainly in the community and in homes, and this has happened in my professional life many times, where I've spent a long time with a family during an assessment. We've had all these conversations as a family unit with the client, and I'm ready to leave. I start walking down the driveway to get to my car, and all of a sudden I hear clip clop behind me of one of the family members who's kind of chasing after me, meets me at the mailbox to say, I know we've just spent 2 hours together and you thought you had the whole family picture, but this is something I need to share with you. Please don't let anybody else know that I'm sharing this with you. And as I had one family member tell me, this is not going to end pretty. We are not the family afternoon special, quote unquote. We have to recognize that, again, there's so much history and information that's happening in these families that we are privy to such a small piece of it, but we can learn more by the way we ask our questions, again, with not judgment, with not expectation of what the answer is, but try to open it up, but also let them know that we can't be complicit in these secrets, that if it impacts the client, there are things that we do have to share and share with a team and share with others, because it could impact the care that we're providing. And sometimes it can rise to a level of vulnerability that we are mandated to talk about. I think it's important for all of us to think about how we handle our own family dynamics and where are we at with those and our relationships, because what we do in our day-to-day life outside of our work impacts how we work day-to-day in our jobs. And we're not working with widgets, so we don't have that luxury of being able to leave our life at the door, particularly when we work in healthcare, and if a member of our family is dealing with a similar illness or we are dealing with a similar illness, how that translates into what we're doing for or with a family. We all know communication is key, and I think this is one of the best illustrations of what communication is all about. The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. That was a quote from Mark Twain, and I think no truer quote could be said. And again, it goes back to my first slide, which is, again, are we talking about difficult families or involved families? And which one gives you the desire to work with a family member or with a family unit to bring out the best in them? The impact of miscommunication is huge, and when we think about that, communication is made up of nonverbal communication, verbal communication, and listening skills. It's an older study, but it really, it stands today. In a 6-year study of the root causes of sentinel events in hospitals, the Joint Commission on Accreditation in Healthcare Organizations, otherwise known as JCAHO, in fact, placed communication at the very top of the list of root causes for sentinel events. So again, the impact of our ability or inability to provide good verbal communication and understand, nonverbal communication, and again, recognize, understand, and interpret, and most importantly, our own listening skills is so key in ensuring that our clients have the best opportunity and the families have the best opportunity to really feel powerful and in more control in an uncontrolled situation. How do we keep those open lines of communication between ourselves, our team, family, and client? It is best if it involves the senior themselves to whatever capacity and capability that senior has. I always identify I'm working with seniors, them as the client, whether they are really able to participate in what we would say in a valid way to really communicate those needs or not. We should always go to conversation first versus crisis management. So again, this is the difference between being proactive and reactive, and how key it is if you are starting to see something shift or change. Don't wait to have that discussion. Have the conversation with everybody involved and put it out on the table. We shouldn't make assumptions. Don't ask for something you yourself would not be willing to do. Listen first, act second. And don't believe that we have all the answers. Again, as healthcare professionals, we ourselves are human, and we don't always have all the answers, particularly if we haven't asked all the questions that we have enough of the pieces to put together. We need to take into account mental abilities, as well as hearing and vision issues, and ensure that communication is done with everybody at their highest level of capacity so that we ensure that people are getting the message in the way that they are able to receive it. And it's often why we do go to family members first and not, I mean, we really are avoiding the senior client. We don't mean to, but it's often easier to have the conversation with them than with the elder who may have, really big sensory limitations, hearing limitations. It takes that much longer for processing information. So that's something to be really aware of. Communication helps when we use examples from outside of the personal. So talking about without divulging, defining information, but talking about how other families may have managed situations or dealt with this, even if you are taking a conglomerate of different client families that you're working with and combining it into one, because again, every family is a combination of other situations. Ask for their advice. You can still learn from them, and that's an important message to give to family members when they're working with seniors, that we should never think about it as a sense of a shift in, I'm parenting my parent. It's probably one of the phrases I like the least, because you are not. They are still your parent, and you have not stepped into that role. Some of the characteristics of the tasks you may be doing may be reminiscent of what a parent would do for somebody who has more needs. But we really need to be cautious, again, of usurping power away from somebody. Who is the keeper of information in this family, and how is it disseminated? And are we being used as an accomplice by not providing full information? And do we truly know that other family members don't want that information and don't have the right to that information? So really think about that when you are finding yourself only communicating with one person in the family versus the team. We have within SYNERGY HomeCare for our families a way that communication can be received from all of our caregivers, the schedule, what's happening, and it's a portal that families can come to and have that ability to see, so that, again, if families aren't good at communicating with one another, there's one place for them to all get it in their way and time that each of them needs it. What are some of the best tools for enhanced relationships with families? The biggest one is proactive planning, really thinking about who this family is and what you're able to do with them. An honest discussion with all involved, really challenging promises versus reality, challenging in a kind way. When families say, I can take care of everything on my own, and being able to kind of talk about, Mary, I think that is incredibly generous, but I also know that you shared with me recently that your daughter is having some health issues and you're, changing jobs, and how is that going to work? And let's really look at that, and how can we bring in services that are going to help you be the family caregiver that you want to be. Remembering what the goal is for all people, regular family meetings, newsletters, conference calls, however best to provide that information. Transparency is key, and families sometimes need to work on their own individual stuff before helping the family situation. As we are running short on time, I want everybody to be, again, aware that decision-making tools, having it in writing, avoids questions during a crisis. And if you're working with a family who still has the capacity to complete these documents, I believe it is our responsibility to provide them with the resources and knowledge of what those different forms can do, because it will aid as we move forward. And the most important thing is to truly understand if someone has a healthcare directive or financial power of attorney, to know when this goes into effect. We also should never stop celebrating the family caregiver and making sure that we have a way as healthcare professionals to really enhance that relationship, to give them tools to continue on that path if that's what they're wanting to do, to work together as a team and not to feel like when we're in there as professionals that, we take over, and then when the family, they take over. This is a a dance. We dance together with family caregivers. Thinking about how we focus on emotional components, not just physical tasks. Giving them ways to make memories, and really, again, when they're not able to be there, I know our caregivers will send pictures of things they're working on. They'll send, through the portal different communication or ways that we are communicating, because it's important that we make memories even if we're not right with each other. So I want to open it up to any questions. I want to share that we will be having and you'll be receiving, if you are on our newsletter, which you can get to from our SYNERGYHomeCare.com website page. You can join the newsletter and you will continue to receive information about upcoming webinars, which all have a certificate of attendance that you can receive after you watch it. Please always feel free to share that link with other colleagues if they're not on that newsletter as well. And you can always connect with one of our local offices who can also come in and share this information with you and your larger team as well, if you would like to do your own kind of personal seminar and conversation on any of the topics that we've discussed. All of our seminars are also available within 24 hours on our Synergy Home Care YouTube channel. So I'd love if there are any questions about this topic or comments. If you do need your certificate of attendance, again, you can just email us, and the next slide will have that on there, at Carla Sutter, CarlaSutter at SYNERGYHomeCare.com. You'll also receive a follow-up to the webinar, and you can also request it through that channel as well. I don't see any questions right now. If you would like to ask a question, feel free also to email me or to connect with your local Synergy Home Care office, which you can find at SYNERGYHomeCare.com, and put in your zip code and it will come up. And I know that all of our owners would love to have conversations and talk more about these family relationships. We see these every day as we come into people's homes and navigate through them to, again, enhance the relationship with the client by way of the family members. I'll just wait one more minute to see if there's any questions or comments. Again, thank you so much for participating in this monthly Synergy Home Care webinar, and we look forward to having you participate in future ones. Next month, we are going to be doing a topic on home care and looking at it from the perspective of across the ages. Really, home care is about care for everyone for Synergy Home Care, and what does that mean, and how do different age groups utilize the services for that. So we look forward to talking with you about any of these topics that we've discussed today or that we have coming up. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.